Hello, students, and welcome to Unit 2 of AP Biology, Cell Structure and Function. And since the unit is on cell structure and function, we thought it made sense to start with what is a cell. So that's what this whole chapter is about. As always, we have lovely tips for success. I encourage you to read through these and do these things because things if you have good habits early on, then things go well, and if you don't, then you start to struggle and you regret it later. So pay attention to this stuff now as opposed to being sad later. That is my advice. So what is a cell? Couple kind of points by way of overview of what a cell is. A cell is the basic unit of all living things. You, for example, are actually made up of cells. So, here we have a cell. We combine a bunch of these together to make a tissue. We combine tissues together to make organs, organs together to make organ systems, and then organ systems together to make you. So you're made up of cells, and the simplest living things are also made up of cells. Here we have three single-celled organisms, amoeba, paramecium, and euglena. They are all single-celled. Bacteria are cells, single-celled organisms. Interestingly, viruses are not single-celled organisms. They are actually not made up of cells, which means, wait, are they living then if they're not made up? That's, foreshadowing for later on, but for now, viruses are not cells. Weird. Okay. Um, Another thing by way of overview is that cells are very specialized for their functions. So you have a lot of different cell types in your body, and each of those types does a different thing. So here, for example, is a neuron. These are the cells that make up your brain, your spinal cord, your nervous system, and you can see it has a very unique structure and shape. Muscle cells kind of look like spaghetti noodles. So one of the problems with, general and enriched biology, and even here in AP biology, we start every single one of those courses with a chapter on cells. And as you're going to see in this slideshow, the cells are always kind of made to look like they're perfectly circular and they have exactly one of each cell structure in there. And, these cells that are found in these intro chapters are very generic cells. So keep in mind that in reality, there's lots of different types of cells which have lots of variations on the basic plan that we're going to talk about in this intro unit. Okay, basic features of every cell. Just the real fundamental structures in every single cell. First is a plasma membrane. This is represented by this blue line, and as I think is obvious from this diagram, this makes up the boundary between the inside and the outside of the cell, and it can regulate what enters and exits the cell. I like to think of it as kind of like a little base, a fence around a military base. If something is inside a military base, there's a fence. It can't get out unless it goes through certain checkpoints, which kind of determine whether or not it's allowed out. If something wants to get in, again, same deal, has to go through a checkpoint. So the cell is similar in that it regulates what is able to enter and exit. Now, certain things are, in fact, small enough to just pass through that fence. So insects might pass through a military base fence. A squirrel could probably climb over. Little birds might fly back and forth across that fence. So same deal with tiny molecules like oxygen and CO2, but for the most part, things are regulated whether or not they can come in or out. If we're to zoom in on that blue line and look at its structure, it would look like this. And we are going to look a lot more closely at this diagram in our next chapter. But for now, you may notice, hey, that little molecule that makes it up looks familiar. Do you remember what type of lipid makes up the cell membrane? Last unit? Anyone? Anyone? Yes, you. Phospholipid. Excellent. It's phospholipid. The cytoplasm then is the interior of the cell. And it basically is just this whole yellowy area right there. It consists of water, a whole bunch of dissolved molecules, and then a bunch of cell structures. Now you'll notice up here that the word cytoplasm, it's actually broken down into cytosol and organelles. The cytosol refers very specifically to that liquidy interior, basically water, with those different molecules dissolved into it. The organelles are membrane enclosed structures embedded within that cytosol. So again, they're membrane enclosed, so this same structure we found in the plasma membrane also surrounds all the organelles, and they have names like mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi complex, lysosome, things you may or may not have learned about last year if you took biology. Well, if you took it, you learned about them, but you may not remember. So the cytoplasm refers to the liquidy interior as well as those organelles. Cytosol just refers to the liquidy interior. And by the way, when you hear things like your body is made up of 80% water, and you think, how is that possible? I remember thinking that it's like, how come when I if I stab myself, why doesn't water just shoot out and then I deflate like a balloon? Well, kind of it does because blood is, in large part water with stuff dissolved into it. But the water is inside these cells. And so, since the cell is mostly water, you are mostly water. Great analogy for thinking about the cytoplasm is a ball pit. We will refer to this, come back to this quite frequently. Every single ball represents a molecule, including water. And these molecules just kind of bouncing around inside this huge interior of the cell. They're all in contact with another. They're all colliding and bouncing against each other like crazy. The organelles you might think of as the kids, these larger objects inside the ball pit. Larger proteins might be a basketball or a soccer ball, but they're all kind of bouncing around. The reason why this analogy is useful is because sometimes you'll look at a diagram of some complex biological process, and then all of a sudden this molecule that has never been mentioned before kind of swoops in and does something, and a lot of kids hey, where did that molecule come from? The answer is it was in the ball pit the whole time, and maybe we were just focused on this orange blobby structure, and we didn't care about that molecule until all of a sudden this figure, now we need it. So it's okay, that molecule, it's been there the whole time, this little yellow ball, that's going to interact and bounce into that orange thing and do something. So when things seem to magically appear, they were in the ball pit the whole time. So that's kind of a useful analogy to keep in mind. Final basic feature is DNA. We're going to talk a ton about DNA later. For now, it directs the activities of the cell by coding for the production of proteins. And hopefully you remember from last unit that proteins kind of do all the major jobs in the cell. They carry out chemical reactions, they let things in and out of the cell, they're structural components. And so by determining which proteins are made, DNA kind of indirectly controls what happens in the cell. It basically is controlling what jobs happen in each cell and therefore what that cell does. So again, much more on that later, but for now, DNA is a thing. It's in a cell. This table, I think it's kind of worth looking at and maybe even writing some of this down. It's a little detailed, but there's these two categories of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, that we're going to talk about in more detail later. Basically, the key points: prokaryotic cells, that means before nucleus. They do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus, and we'll talk about what a nucleus is soon. Bacteria are prokaryotic. Everything else is a eukaryotic cell. Your cells are eukaryotic cells. Those single-celled critters, paramecium, euglena, and amoeba that we talked about, those are eukaryotic cells. Viruses, by the way, remember, are not either of these two categories. And so eukaryotic cells have their DNA in a nucleus, prokaryotic cells do not, and then there's some other differences that we're going to talk about later. But I think this table is worth pausing to read through. So the other type is, within the eukaryotic cell category, animals and plants have some fairly significant differences between them that we'll look at as well. So just keep in mind there's different types of cells. So before we get into all the different parts that make up a cell, there's one final thing we need to address, and that is why are cells even a thing? Why do we need them? Why do they exist? Do we need lots of little tiny cells to make up my body? Couldn't we just have one big cell? Why? And the answer actually has a lot to do with math, and specifically the surface area to volume ratio. So at this point, I would like you to find your formulas and equation sheet for AP Biology. We gave this to you at the start of the year, and it's also available on Schoology. But for sure, I'd like you to pause and make sure you have that sheet because we're going to need it frequently during this class, and you want to just make sure you have it. And then once you find that sheet, find this section of it. Okay, and just kind of confirm that, yep, okay, I found the sheet and I have this stuff. So pause, find it. Did you find it? Great. What I want you to do is to use these formulas to do some calculations. Now you might think, wait, this is biology, why are we doing math? But remember, on the AP exam, they are going to give you math-based questions. For sure, you will have to do math-based questions, and any formula on that formulas and equation sheet is fair game. So what I'm about to ask you to do could very well be a question on the AP exam. So what I want you to do is this. Imagine you have 3 different cells. The first cell is relatively small with a radius of 1 unit, and we'll use an arbitrary unit of length. The second the second cell is intermediate, and the third cell is very large. And so what I want you to do is calculate the surface area, the volume, and the surface area to volume ratio for each of these cells. Please, please, please do it. Pause the video, get a calculator out, and do it. Because like I said, you could very well be asked to do this on the AP exam. And so you got to practice and make sure you know how to do it. So do it, pause, and I'm about to click. Did you do it? Here I go. I'm clicking with the answers. Here's the answers. Okay. Now, the question here is what happens to this ratio as cells get larger? Well, you'll notice that as the cells get larger, the surface area to volume ratio gets smaller. That becomes significant. Why? Well, I've got a nice little video clip here, and if you have the slideshow, I think it's worth watching, but for this purpose, I'll just kind of give you the gist. So in this video, they do a demonstration where they take different cubes of agar. Agar is this, it's kind of the consistency of Jell-O, and they immerse that agar in phenolphthalein solution, which you may recall from chemistry is pink when it's exposed to a base, but clear when it's exposed to an acid. So we've got these cubes that are solid, pink all the way through, and then we take a large, a medium, and a small version of these cubes, and we toss them in a beaker of acid. Now when that happens, the acid on the surface of these cubes is going to turn the surface clear. And then slowly that acid is going to enter that cube and kind of make its way deeper and deeper into the interior and change the color from pink to clear. So take a moment to kind of visualize which of these cubes do you think is going to be the most clear after a given length of time? Here's the answer. Well, actually, yeah. No, here's the answer. The answer is the small one. And so why is that? Well, the surface area to volume ratio increases as cells get smaller. In other words, the small cell has more surface area relative to its volume, which means the acid has an easier time getting to the interior of the cell. Here, this large cube has much less surface area relative to its volume. So the acid just has a harder time penetrating so far into that interior because it's such a large cell. And so having lots and lots of very, very small cells means that you have a high surface area to volume ratio. If you have a large cell, the surface area to volume ratio is teeny, but if you chop that large cell into tiny cells, then your overall surface area to volume ratio is huge. And so this is better because it ensures that cells have an adequate surface area to exchange the materials they need to support their volume. In other words, cells have to be small. They have to be small so that they can get oxygen, nutrients, and other important molecules into the interior of them. If they're too big, oxygen, nutrients, and other important materials can't get to the interior and the cell can't support itself. So this is why cells are a thing, and this is why cells are small. Okay. And that's basically what I just said. Okay. So the final aspect of surface area to volume that I wanted to mention is that organelles actually help increase the surface area for cellular processes. And so you can see just this blue thing, who cares what it's called? It's the endoplasmic reticulum, because some of you I'm sure do. But by having, this kind of weird squiggly shape, it's increasing the surface area for whatever processes are happening there. Here you can see in this yellow thing, this happens to be something called a mitochondria. It's squiggly in there. Again, that increases the surface area. So this idea of surface area is hugely important in biology, and we'll be coming back to that many times. So at this point, I'm going to pause, and then our next screencast, we'll look at the different organelles that make up your cells.